In our lesson today, we're going to be looking at a parable that Jesus told over in Luke chapter 10. And as we look at this parable, we're going to be looking at what may be one of the more well-known parables that Jesus gave, as we're going to be looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, when we study the parables, what we need to understand is that Jesus is using an illustration that people would be very familiar with the concept of what he was talking about, very easy for them to relate to it, and then he would use that to describe some spiritual truth. And that's what he's doing here on this occasion as well, where you have this parable of the Good Samaritan, where you have a man who was going down the road, he encountered some robbers, he was beaten, he was left for dead. 3 men found him, but only one of them stopped to help. And that was what we know today as the Good Samaritan. So we're going to look at this lesson here today. And as we study this parable, what we want to do is try to identify what is the main point that Jesus is making here. Once we identify the main point, we will then be able to step back and make some applications that we can take and put into practice in our lives today. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in our lesson today. So we're going to start by looking at this parable in Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 30. Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him for dead. And by chance a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side." So you see the situation as Jesus is describing it here. You have a man, he's traveling from one city to another. He's beaten, he's left for dead. And you have these first two individuals who encounter him, a priest and a Levite. Both of them see him, but both of them continue on their way. They pass by on the other side, they don't stop to help. Then he goes on and says, "But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him, and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day he took 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you.'" So you have the first 2 individuals, saw the man in need, did not stop to help, and then a complete change with the third man. The one who was from Samaria, he stopped and helped. Jesus then, as he wraps up this parable, he asks the question, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, "The one who showed mercy to him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." So that's the parable that we're going to be looking at here in our lesson today. Now, we need to understand the context so we can get a understanding why Jesus gave this parable here. Notice when we read it, it says Jesus replied. He was answering a question. This was given as a response to a question. Luke 10 and verse 29, you have a man, a lawyer, asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Well, what was it that happened that brought about that question and then Jesus' parable? This lawyer came to Jesus to test him. And he was asking him a question about inheriting eternal life. In Luke chapter 10, verse 25, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, we don't know exactly where he was going to go with this question. We know he was testing him, but he began with this question, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus, though, as the master teacher, he had this man provide the answer to his own question. Notice how it's recorded here in Luke 10, verses 26 through 28. He said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." So Jesus had this man answer this question, well, what does the law say? And he answered that question, what the law says. And Jesus says, well, that's right. Do that and you will live. That's not what this man wanted to, that's not how he wanted to end this conversation. Again, he was trying to trap Jesus. He was not trying to trap himself. But by Jesus turning this question around on him, he had been trapped. This man who asked the question, he was trying to trap Jesus, but he had been trapped because he had been convicted of his own failure to live up to the standard that is found in the law of God. He needed to repent. He needed to change things because he had not lived up to what he had just answered. And so it says there in verse 29, but wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? He was trying to justify himself. He was trying to find a reason to not have to do what he just answered, not have to do what the law said. Remember, he was a lawyer. If there's anyone who can find a loophole and a reason to not have to do what the law says to do, a lawyer is going to find that loophole. But he wasn't going to find this loophole that he was hoping for. He was not living up to that standard that was in the laws. Jesus had him give the answer himself. He was not living up to that standard, but he was not wanting to change. He was trying to justify himself. He was trying to find some reason to not have to do that. So what's the basic point of this parable? Again, you have the parable. In this parable, you have a man who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And as he's going along the road, he falls among robbers. He's beaten, he's robbed, he's left for dead. And then you have two men who see him. And as we read about them, both of them see him, both of them pass by on the other side, and they're identified in the parable. You have a priest and you have a Levite. They saw him, they passed by, they refused to help. We'll talk about them in just a little bit as far as who a priest and a Levite would have been. But it's important that Jesus identified them as a priest and a Levite. You have a third man who did stop to help. The one who is identified as the Samaritan, and we know him as the Good Samaritan. That's just how we've identified this over the years. But he is a Samaritan. He was on a journey. This was from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he was not in his hometown. He did not live in Jerusalem, was traveling to Jericho, or lived in Jericho and was going back home. He was away from home. He was from Samaria, and yet he is the one who would be more inconvenienced than the others, but he is the one who stopped to help. He was the one who was willing to make a sacrifice to help this one who was in need. So Jesus asked the question to the lawyer, who proved to be a neighbor to this injured traveler, to this man who was beaten and left for dead? Who proved to be a neighbor to him? That's how Jesus answered this question, where he asked, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus asked, who proved to be a neighbor? And the answer was obvious. You have two people who didn't help. You have one person who did help. Who was the neighbor? Or who proved to be the neighbor? Well, it was the one who stopped to help. The answer was obvious, and the lawyer answered that correctly. And so Jesus told him, you go do the same. So the main point of this parable for us to understand is what Jesus is calling all of us to do, is that we are to prove to be a neighbor to those who need a neighbor. To those who are in need, who need someone to help, we need to prove to be a neighbor to them. So as we go back and look at this parable, we first see that there are two men who passed by and refused to help. As we read and as I mentioned, we were going to get to this, it was a priest and a Levite. Why is this significant? Why did Jesus identify them and not just, some random citizen of Jerusalem and then some other person, or name some other occupations? Like here was a fisherman, or here was a carpenter, or someone like that. Why did he identify them as a priest and a Levite? Well, the reason why is because these individuals, they were set apart by God himself to offer sacrifices and attend to his service. We see this throughout the Old Testament, and this continued in through the days of Jesus in the New Testament. But in passages like Numbers chapter 18, verses 6 and 7, you have God speaking to Aaron and explaining to him that Aaron and his sons were going to serve as priests, and the Levites were given to them, dedicated by God for that service, to help with that service of the tabernacle. Later it would be the temple. But you have the priests that were set apart by God. They would offer sacrifices. They would make atonement for the people and make the offerings that were required. The Levites, they were there to assist. They were there to help. They were there to serve. Both of them, the priest and the Levite, they were both committed to the Lord's work. And they would have been recognized by others as being committed to the Lord's work. And so you could have a random citizen of Jerusalem who is dedicated to serving the Lord. You could have someone who's of some other occupation who is dedicated and committed to being faithful to the Lord. You could have that. But these ones here, they were known specifically for that. They were involved in the Lord's work on a regular basis, and everyone knew that about them. Then you have the third man who did stop to help, who was a Samaritan. We need to understand that in that time, there was not a peaceful accord or agreement or relationship, is probably the better term. There was not peace between Jews and Samaritans. The Jews did not think highly of the Samaritans. They looked down upon them. When Jesus in John chapter 4 stopped and was speaking with the Samaritan woman there by the well, John made the comment in recording that event. He said the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And so it was unusual for Jesus as a Jew to be speaking with this Samaritan woman, besides the fact that she was a woman, and that would not have been traditionally or typically done during that time. But besides that, she was a Samaritan. The Jews didn't have dealings with Samaritans, but Jesus showed that he was coming to help everyone, to save everyone, to provide everyone with that living water, as he spoke to her about there in John chapter 4. But the Jews of that time, they did not think highly of the Samaritans. And so because of that, you have a Samaritan going by. He's in the land of the Jews, going from Jerusalem to Jericho. And you have this one who would presumably be a Jew who has been beaten and left for dead. And here's a Samaritan who's been looked down upon by the Jews all his life. It would be very easy for him to justify not helping, to just walk by, pretend he didn't see anything, and think that, well, Jews wouldn't appreciate any help from me anyway, so I'm not even going to help. It would have been very easy for him to do that, but he didn't. He was willing to spend his time, stop and help. He was on a journey. And so this was more of an inconvenience for him than it would have been for the priest or the Levite. He was willing to spend his time, he was willing to spend his energy and working to help bandage this man up, put him on his own beast, to take him to the innkeeper. He spent his money in order to make sure he was cared for, all for a stranger who was in need. Every aspect of this, of what the Samaritan did, it was a sacrifice for him. We need to understand that this was not just, he didn't really have anything else to do and had all of these extra provisions. No, he was on a journey. He had what he needed. And now he was stopping, he was taking time, he was doing this work, and he was providing resources or funds to help provide for this one who was in need. So that's the parable. It's very simple, very easy for us to understand. And again, it's one of the more well-known parables of Jesus. There are a lot of people who know and understand or have heard that parable. They understand the basic point. What are some applications now that we can make from this parable of the Good Samaritan? Number one, we may be outwardly religious and still not be right with God. Again, you had a priest and a Levite who were committed and dedicated to serving the Lord. They would have been known by everyone, recognized by everyone as being in the Lord's service. But Jesus made it clear that they were not right with the Lord. They were not doing what they should have been doing. They did not stop to help when they could have and therefore should have. We can be outwardly religious and still not be right with God. Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 23 about the religious leaders or those who would be looked up to as being the examples of faithfulness among the Jews. But he said there to the Pharisees in Matthew 23, 27, and 28, that you are like whitewashed tombs, that outwardly you appear beautiful to men, but inside, it says you are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. We've been talking about in recent weeks, going through the book of James, and one of the points that we saw there in James 1 and verse 27, James talked about pure and undefiled religion. And that pure and undefiled religion was about helping orphans and widows in their distress and helping those who are in need. And again, as we talked about then, that's not limited to orphans and widows. We could help others. We could help the one who is on the side of the road injured because he's been beaten and left for dead like you have in this parable. But that's part of the religion of Christ that he's called us to do and to practice, is that we are to help others. Now, this is not to say that the outward things that we do, the worship to God, the service that we do, it's not to say that that's not important. It is important, but it's not all there is. We can be outwardly religious. We can show up to church services every week, and we could still not be right with the Lord. So we need to examine ourselves. Those of us who are outwardly religious, those of us who are assembling regularly, even weekly, to worship God, we need to examine ourselves and make sure that we are fully committed to following the will of God and doing His will, not just making it appear to others that that's what we're doing. Another lesson from this parable is that we are to help those who are in need when we encounter them, when we have these opportunities. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, Paul said that while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. There are times where we will encounter fellow Christians who are in need. We are to do everything that we can to help them. But even beyond that, Paul says that you in your daily lives, you encounter someone who is in need, you have that opportunity. You need to take advantage of that opportunity to help them. And that means if we're going to do that, if we're going to take advantage of these opportunities, that means being open to helping those who are different from us. Just like the Samaritan was willing to help this one, presumably who was a Jew, as he was between Jerusalem and Jericho. He was willing to help him. We need to be willing to help those who may be different from us. Maybe those who are not the same race as we are, or have the same culture, not of the same economic class. Maybe they're poorer than us. Maybe they're in poverty and we think, well, we don't want to help them. Or maybe circumstances happen where you have some rich person and they're stuck on the side of the road. They're in need. And we think, well, they have everything good enough in this life. We don't need to help them. It doesn't matter one way or the other. If we have an opportunity to help others, then we ought to take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves to us, and they will. A third lesson from this parable is that we are to be willing to make sacrifices in order to help others. Because we're not going to come into a situation where it really doesn't cost us anything to help others. It's always going to cost something. When Paul wrote to the brethren in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 about helping needy Christians in Jerusalem, he said that The brethren in Macedonia, they've already committed to doing this. And he described the brethren in Macedonia as being ones who were in deep poverty. But yet they overflowed in the wealth of their generosity, as he described there in the first part of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. They wanted to do everything that they could. Paul said that I knew that they couldn't afford this, that it was beyond their ability, but they gave beyond their ability. They wanted to make sacrifices. Over in James chapter 2, we've already talked about James already, and again, we've done some lessons recently on the book of James. But in James chapter 2, where he talks about the necessary connection between faith and works, he says in James 2:15, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. It doesn't cost us anything to wish someone well, to send them on their way and just hope everything turns out better. That's no sacrifice on our part. It doesn't cost us anything. It does cost us something to provide them with a meal, to provide them the clothing that they are lacking. That does cost us something. It's a sacrifice. We need to be willing to make sacrifices in order to help others. Another lesson from this parable is that we are to put ourselves in a position to where we can help. Now, what this means is when we think about what we need in order to provide for ourselves, provide for our family, and take care of the regular responsibilities that we have, the scriptures teach that we are to work in order to do this. We work to provide for ourselves. We work to provide for our family. But do we do beyond that? Are we just barely scraping by and we really don't have anything else that we might be able to use to help others? Now, there are times when, because of circumstances that are beyond our control or a temporary measure, that we may just be barely scraping by. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But when we're content with that, thinking, well, I don't need to do any more, then that's where we need to think about what Paul is going to say in this passage we're going to look at here in Ephesians chapter 4, that we have a responsibility to work to be able to have something to help others. Yes, there are ways we can help besides monetarily, but a lot of times that help that we are able to provide comes from the money that we have or the resources that we are able to obtain from the income that we have, the work that we do. Over in Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 28, it says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. It's not enough. If we're going to be faithful to the Lord, it's not enough just to do the least that we can to get by and think that, well, as long as I'm providing the bare necessities for myself or maybe for my family, then that's all I need to do. I don't need to try to improve. I don't need to try to work harder. I don't need to try to do anything else because that's all I need to do. No. Paul said here in this verse that you need to be working so that you are able to help someone who is in need. And if all you're able to do is just barely provide for yourself and your family, then you're not fulfilling that instruction there in Ephesians 4 and verse 28. Now, again, there may be times where we are just barely scraping by, and that may be temporary, and there's nothing wrong with that. Or there could be other times where we are the ones who are in need, and there's no shame in receiving help when that is the case. But we should be striving to put ourselves in a position where we can help others who are in need. Paul said over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, instruct those who are rich in this present world, not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct the rich, to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. Now, for a lot of us, we don't think of ourselves as rich, but when we look at how a lot of people, there's certain situations that they live in every day around the world, those of us, at least in this country, probably would be classified as rich. So what do we need to do? We need to be ready to share, rich in good works. And so part of being able to help others is putting ourselves in a position where we can do that, where we have the resources available, that we have extra that we can share, whether it's money or food or something else. We have the ability to share with others. And then the final point that I want us to take from this is that we may not need to emulate those who are well respected. Again, Jesus mentioned the priest and the Levite. These are ones that people would have looked up to as being the examples, as being the ones who would show them what it means to be a faithful follower of God. But they weren't the ones that they should have been looking up to here. It was the Samaritan that so many of them would have looked down upon. He was the one that they were to follow his example. Notice what Jesus said a little bit later in Luke chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. When we think about the priest and the Levite, these were religious leaders, and along with them, you also have the Pharisees, who would be under the same class, the same general group of those who were elevated above the people. The people would look up to. They were religious. They were the ones who put themselves in this position of being head over the people. Notice what it says here in Luke chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him, scoffing at Jesus. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men. You make yourselves look good," is what he's saying. "You justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God." There may be those who are highly esteemed among men, but God knows their hearts. They're not the ones that we are to look up to. They're not the ones that we are to follow, because they are not following God's standard. Over in Luke 22, verses 24 through 26, here we have a conversation with Jesus' own disciples. It says there arose a dispute among them as to which one was regarded to be greatest. And he said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you. But the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and leader like the servant." Among Jesus' disciples, you were not to have those who were striving to have everyone look up to them, and everyone would submit to them, everyone would serve them. That's not the way it's supposed to be. You, as the leader, you're to be the servant. You are to be the one who's showing the example. Not like the leaders of the Gentiles who lord it over them, who boss them around, who order them and make them do this for them. That's not how it is to be among you. But you have those who are highly regarded, who are highly esteemed, who are well respected. They're not always the ones that we need to follow their example. The example we follow is Christ, and those who are faithful to him, as is described to us in his word. As we see, the standard of faith is his word. We follow that example. We follow that teaching. And there are a lot of people who might be well respected, but they're not the ones we are to follow. As we close this lesson, we think about this parable and the lesson that Jesus is teaching here. From time to time, we are going to encounter people who are in need. Those who, to use the language of the parable and the question surrounding it, we're going to encounter people who need a neighbor, someone who proved to be a neighbor to them. That's what we need to do. We need to prove to be a neighbor to those who are in need. Be ready and willing to help. Again, it's not enough simply to have an outward show of being religious. It's not enough just to show up to church services when the doors are open. That's important. But there's more to faithfulness than that. So let's look to ourselves and what we're doing in everyday situations, especially when it comes to here's someone who is in need. Here's someone who we can help. And this is not, someone who's pretending to be in need, someone who is actually in need. Are we able to help them? Can we put ourselves in a position that we can help? And then are we willing to do that? That's what we've been called to do. That's the message of the Good Samaritan. So let's look for those opportunities. Let's look for the chances that we might have to help those who are in need, and then not walk by and pretend like we didn't see it, but instead take the time, make the sacrifices that we need so that we can help those who need it.